Destination, paradise, introduction. It's embarrassing to say, and I don't mention this often because doing so usually brings forth raised eyebrows and high arcing rolls of the eyes. But the truth is, I once had a moment in my life when I was struck by a revelation that was so powerful that it knocked me off of my proverbial horse. After receiving this earth-shaking revelation, the specifics of which will be described in a few moments, I certainly wasn't destined to change the course of history like the Apostle Paul, Newton, or Luke Skywalker. Oh no. However, I thought I was. And I didn't just think it, I knew it. When my life originally took that dramatic turn and the purpose of my life seemingly came into focus, I was on a road trip out west. At the time, I was planning on going back to college to get a master's degree in business administration. Having set off from the state of Michigan, I was in the midst of visits to a number of business schools. Unexpectedly, that trip turned out to be incredibly exhilarating for a certain less than worldly Midwesterner. Amazing sights like California's Highway 1, where the mystical Green Mountains crash into the Pacific south of Monterey, had my mind twisting, contorting, and expanding in regards to what I thought was possible with my life. As the trip continued south through California and east through the desert to Arizona, I planned to visit a university in Tucson. On the evening before the day of my visit to the college, I checked into a Motel 6. That evening at the motel, my life truly changed forever when I was struck by the thunderous foresight that I would one day be, drumroll, a U.S. president. And get this, I wasn't going to be elected in any boring and ordinary year like most other presidents. No way. The year that had been preordained for my election, 2020, happened to have limitless possibilities relating to the theme 2020 vision. Since I had, in a blinding flash, come to the unassailable conclusion that I was going to be a future president, I figured that I should begin to make proper and prudent preparations for that eventual reality. From the outset, my idea of an ideal leader was someone who really knew the United States, someone who had toiled in the fields, so to speak, as he or she traveled from place to place while learning about the country at the local level. I reasoned that the best presidential candidate would be one who had, in essence, earned a master's in America. And I didn't want to waste any time in earning what I thought would be the appropriate education. I immediately headed back to Michigan, packed up my stuff, and spent more than 3 years on the road getting to know the country. And we're not talking hobnobbing, elaborate high teas, and hoity-toity social events. Instead, I got down and dirty alongside everyday Americans, working the potato fields in Blackfoot, Idaho, manning a bottled water assembly line in Seattle, stocking Kmart shelves in Boston, working high-rise construction in Tampa, and washing school buses in Detroit. These types of jobs were what financed my travels from town to town and state to state. As for sleeping arrangements in many cities, I, during the first portion of my time on the road, bunked in my car. Later on, I, for more than a year, resided directly under the stars as I traveled the country with my backpack and sleeping bag. During that period, my overnight accommodations were rather interesting. I crashed in a street gents van in Venice Beach, California, on someone else's cardboard boxes that were flattened at the corner of Mission and 10th Street in San Francisco, on the back of a coal car in Toledo, Ohio, in the back of a Red Cross emergency response vehicle in New York City, and in a hole that I dug in Manchester, New Hampshire. From subway trains to burial grounds, from dugout benches to park benches, from New York Central Park to Washington, D.C.'s Lafayette Park, I subsisted out and about in more than 100 towns and cities. As a matter of fact, the chances are pretty good that during the course of my travels, I made camp within the city limits of your town. The mentioned kinds of work experiences combined to form as a first of many planned steps, which included expectations to run for public office at various levels, the type of foundation that I felt would be beneficial to a presidential candidate. My hope was that Americans all across the country would know that I made a sincere attempt to learn a bit about them. Americans would know that during the course of a considerable journey, I had stepped into their own towns with the aspiration of learning about their communities and the types of jobs that they worked. So, that was the first step. Step 2 was to try to find out if my efforts rang true to anyone in the country besides me. My yardstick was the media. If the national media would be willing to tune into my 1,000-day trip across America, then I figured it would be an indicator that I was hitting a note that had the potential to resonate. It took a while before anyone paid much attention to my efforts. Once people did start to take notice, though, things really started to buzz. Before too long, I'd done well over 100 newspaper, television, and radio interviews with news outlets all across the country. Even Dan Rather of CBS Evening News reported my coast-to-coast expedition on his nightly telecast, stating, "His may seem like an unusual approach to running for the Oval Office, but it is working. He sleeps in his car and works as a day laborer wherever he goes. Brian Anderson may not be a household name, but just wait." Now, I felt like I was headed in the right direction. Yet then, like one of Don Quixote's traveling boots getting stuck in the mud, things started to get kind of bogged down on my third step, which was to complete a book about my experiences on the road. The delays that I'd begun to encounter were attributable in part to the fact that my lengthy trek in such a large country had left me with much to write about. The real problem, though, was that I was trying to do the writing while I was continuing to travel. I was trying to do the writing while at the same time I was trying to survive outside in unfamiliar environs. That was a pretty tough task. And every time I'd hunker down and finally start to make some writing progress in a particular city, I'd get restless for adventure and I'd wind up blasting off to my next location. Eventually, I had visited either very briefly or rather extensively each of the contiguous 48 states, but a part of me didn't feel complete, so I hitchhiked up to Alaska. By that point, there was only one place left, one destination that was imperative for me to experience. So it was that after spending some time exploring our 49th state, I booked a flight out of Anchorage to our 50th. I didn't expect my stay in the middle of the Pacific to be very extensive. I just wanted to put down stakes in the tropical paradise of Hawaii long enough to finish up a single, all-inclusive book about my U.S. travels. As had been the case on the mainland during the preceding period, I planned to reside out and about through the course of the writing process. The reasoning for doing so, besides simply continuing the modus operandi, because old habits sometimes die hard, was to keep costs low, to keep the spirit of adventure high, and to try to prove to Americans that I had a little bit of grit and determination. There were some basic ground rules to my travels, cheating the impecunious and penurious nature of the experience by, for example, renting a hotel room was strictly prohibited. As for where in resplendent Hawaii I was going to initially settle, I wasn't exactly sure. All I knew was that I'd never before been to the place where I was going, and per the norm, I was going to be a bit of a stranger in a strange land. During the span of time that I spent on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, my presidential initiatives, at least those aspects of my initiatives that related to publicizing my efforts, were, due to necessity, set on the shelf and left to gather a little dust while I focused on my writing. That's because, as you'll discover in a a little more detail. Numerous challenges led to things taking substantially longer with my writing project than had been anticipated. Since I was inhabiting the always eventful out of doors in the tropics while that longer was happening, an additional manuscript unexpectedly sprang up, took root, and flourished. An additional manuscript sprang up and took root that describes an extraordinary and outlandish sojourn in paradise. That Hawaiian manuscript, which happened to be finalized before the more extensive mainland manuscript, led to the light-hearted and, dare I say, humorous book that you currently hold in your hands. Now, we already know that more than likely, wherever you live in the United States, the first portion of my journey came within extremely close proximity to your own journey when I passed through or very near to your own neighborhood. Perhaps we even crossed paths on the street. At this time, let's take a voyage and do some adventuring together. Let's find out where my little twisting and turning journey took me. Let's discover some of the lessons that were learned. Let's take a wild and exhilarating ride and see exactly where this period of my travels, in which the unremitting adventure really begins, is going to take us.